Hello, and welcome to the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center, and welcome to those of you watching at home through our live stream. My name is Ali Amr Ghassemi, and I'm currently an intern here at the Palestine Center. Today's event marks the third and final installment of our 2015 Summer Intern Lecture Series. The series, entitled Gaza in Perspective, Realities on the Ground, Representation and Broader Implications, took stock of Gaza on the anniversary of last summer's war. Our two previous lectures focused on Gaza's significance in the broader Palestinian-Israeli conflict and its economic and infrastructural rehabilitation. Today's panel, Operation Protective Edge, Representations in the U.S. Media, takes a more outward approach, investigating how the 2014 Israel-Gaza war was portrayed across different media outlets in the United States. Last summer, images from the latest, deadliest Israeli campaign in Gaza dominated television sets across the country. Awareness of the situation quickly grew, as did discourse. Some outlets defended Israel's action in self-defense and pinned blame on Hamas for Palestinian suffering. Others still criticized Israel's campaign as asymmetrical and its policies as having no regard for civilian life. The media has an undeniable ability to shape public opinion through its coverage. What then were Americans hearing and seeing about the war last summer? How was the conflict represented or perhaps misrepresented? In covering the war, were there any instances of bias or reductionism, and if so, across which media outlets? And how did these factors in sum influence public opinion on Gaza? These are just a few of the questions that our speakers will be addressing today. With that, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our speakers. Dr. Edmond Gharib was the American University Center for Global Peace's first Mustafa Barzani Scholar of Global Kurdish Studies. He is an internationally recognized expert on the Kurds, Iraq, and media issues. He taught at American University for 28 years and has also taught at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. and in Qatar, the University of Virginia, and the George Washington University. He is the author of the Kurdish Nationalist Movement and the Kurdish Question in Iraq, and is co-author of War in the Gulf and the Historical Dictionary of Iraq. He is the editor of Split Vision, The Portrayal of Arabs in the American Media, the first book of its kind to cover media portrayal of Arabs. Dr. Gharib has written and lectured widely on U.S. policy towards the Middle East, U.S.-Arab relations, Arab Americans, the American media and its coverage of the Middle East, and the information revolution in the Arab world, Iraq, the Kurds, and the Gulf. He worked as a journalist for many years and has been widely interviewed by major American, Arab, European, and Asian media outlets. Omar Badr is a political analyst, digital producer, and human rights advocate based in Washington, D.C. He holds an MA in International Relations and Comparative Politics from the University of Memphis, where his research focused on U.S. Middle East policy. He is former executive director of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee of Massachusetts and the former director of the Palestine Cultural Center for Peace in Boston, Massachusetts. He has participated in dozens of panels, lectures, and debates on college and university campuses throughout the U.S. His media appearances include the BBC, Sky News, Voice of America, Russia Today, and several other outlets, and his writings have appeared in Salon, Huffington Post, The Daily Beast, Jadaliyya, among other platforms. We are privileged to have Dr. Gharib and Mr. Badr with us today and highly appreciative of their perspective, given their background in media studies. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to talk, which will be followed by some time for questions from the audience. For those of you watching at home, you can tweet your questions on Twitter to @PalestineCenter. As a last reminder before we begin, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off now. Now please help me in welcoming Dr. Edmond Gharib.
Thank you, Ali. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to see a number of friends, some of them I haven't seen in a long time, here today. What I'm going to talk about today is basically a couple of things. One is how the American media has covered the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and why it has covered it in the way it did. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gaza war of last year and some of the changes that have begun to take place as a result of that war, or partly because of the changes that have been taking place in terms of the social media and its role, and I'm sure Omar is going to be talking about that, at least in part. And then hopefully we'll see what kind of questions that you have. Well, this conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict specifically, and it's becoming more and more the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, as fewer Arabs are actually seem to be as involved as they were at one time. Nevertheless, this issue remains a very important issue for many people all over the Arab world. And I think it will continue to be as long as there are people who believe that this issue is an important one. It's the cause of a people who have been the victims of injustice in many ways. And so as a result of this, I believe that until the Palestinians gain their right to self-determination, we are likely to continue to see this problem fester and sometimes erupt in the same way it has been doing in recent years. One of actually the latest incident was this, the burning by some settlers, allegedly, of a Palestinian home in the village of Douma, where a child of 18, a baby actually of 18 months was burned. Partly, again, there was, what's interesting about this is that at the same time, the way the media covered this story, they covered it in the same way as they did in the past. For example, the New York Times described it as arson. Now, if it was a Palestinian doing that, probably it would have been described as terrorism. But at the same time, there's been also a great deal of criticism, widespread condemnation of this event, including by Israeli officials. Whether it started with the opposition as leader, and it went to the prime minister, as well as many journalists, many people, religious leaders. And that's in many ways, it's a very significant development. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is in many ways, when it comes to media coverage, when it comes to information, is basically that we are seeing here two narratives. There is a Palestinian narrative and there is an Israeli narrative, and both sides want to make sure that their narratives is the one that is out there before the public, and that the public accepts. The Israelis, for example, have said that what happened in Gaza last year, said that in defense of what the Israeli army did, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that the Israeli army is probably the most moral army in the world. He also said that he said the Hamas and the Palestinians hide missiles and weapons in the tunnels and hospitals and schools and mosques, and that they hold the people hostage. The Palestinians say that it's Israel that's the aggressor. Israel has been the occupier. It has killed civilians, destroyed the infrastructure. And there were also some Arabs who criticized Hamas, actually blaming it for saying that it didn't talk too much about a victory and did not focus enough, as it should have been, on the victims, and at least that would have been probably a better way to get public attention to this issue. This battle has been bloody in many ways. The European Mediterranean Observatory for Human Rights said that the number of victims was 2,147 dead Palestinians, including 330 children, 302 women, 23 medical staff, as well as 16 journalists, and including 11 people who were working with UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. At the same time, what we saw, the Israelis, a number of Israelis were also killed. The number of Hamas fighters is said to be 340. The number of Israeli soldiers who died was 64. The number of Israeli civilians who died was 6. And the wounded were 120. And there was also one woman and child. Among the Palestinians, of course, the numbers were much, much higher. As we said, there are 530 children, 302 women, and as well as others. Let me turn here to what has been the problem with the media coverage. Well, the U.S., of course, and Israel say that the conflict will end when the Palestinians give up their commitment to terrorism and accept Israel's right to exist. The Palestinians say that they have already agreed to Israel's right to exist, but that they will continue to resist until the liberation of all the occupied territories, and they can determine their future by themselves. Most people in the world, actually, although this is a generalization, but I believe it to be true, most people accept or tend to accept the Palestinian narrative much more than the Israeli narrative. They see the Palestinians as a people dispossessed, a people who lost their land, and they basically in part put most of the blame on the Israeli for the continued occupation. However, in the United States, there is a different picture, different portrayal, and part of it has to do with the way the media has covered this story. Very few know, actually, very few people are aware of the dynamics of this triangle: the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. And basically that's because very few people know, for example, the extent of the support that the United States gives, the taxpayers give to the Israelis, and also the protection that the United States government provides to Israel whenever the issue of its violation of human rights come up before the UN or other international fora. And of course guarantee Israel's edge, strategic edge over not only the Palestinians but against all of its neighbors. Well, in many ways, the media has generally failed to give context for this conflict and has avoided answering some of the basic journalistic questions of who, where, when, and what, and why. The media has shown that the core of the struggle, in many ways, of the core of this conflict, is not portraying the Palestinians as people who have a legitimate or who have a case, at least, and showing some balance in the way the story is covered. Part of the problem, of course, is that the coverage comes from an Israeli-centric perspective in many ways. One of the other things that I think it's important to mention here is that when we talk about the role of the American media, over the past several decades, the American media have gone through some of the best and maybe the worst of times. They have provided some of the most balanced coverage of many issues facing the American public, and they have exposed governmental abuse, corruption, waste, etc. And they also have served the unique role that the founders of this republic wanted them to play, and that's the role of the watchdog. But the media remain, in many ways, the most effective channel for the transfer of information necessary for political action. Information by governments, non-governmental organizations, labor unions, churches, human rights groups, and others who want to communicate to the public or to each other. And that applies both to the United States as well as abroad. There are, in many ways, they are the means for communicating the views of the various players and most of the participants in the political game. Of course, today, there's also another role. Here I was talking mostly about the mainstream media, but there's now an increasing role for the social media which has emerged as a result of the information technology revolution that has changed the way we received both our entertainment as well as our news. With varying degrees of success, all players use the media. They do it to promote and discuss their issues, to establish the framework for debate over basically trying to set the national and international agendas, and to assess the success and failure of their policies. And so in this sense, the media are among the most powerful players in both in helping set the agenda for the national as well as international issues. And of course, however, in recent years, we've seen a lot of controversy surrounding the media and the way it covers stories and domestic issues all over the various parts of the United States. In many ways, television and the print coverage of momentous events has been generally has not reached the level that it deserves in some parts of the U.S. media, although in the last several decades we've begun to see dramatic changes in the coverage. And we have seen this actually perhaps more so after the wars of Iraq and more recently the wars in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and other areas. But there are a number of reasons why the media has failed or has not been as effective or as balanced as it could be, is that part of it has to do with the conglomerization of the media and the increasing competition for revenue, producing more infotainment, and leading to the what I've called the McDonaldization of news. One of the things that we are seeing these days is that, especially when it comes to international stories, and particularly the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, many people are saying that the media has not been doing its job. Some of the criticism is coming, in fact, from those working in the media themselves. Ted Standard, who worked for a long time with United Press International and then shifted to become as an academic who writes extensively about the media. He said that to him what he saw, he said, when watchdogs, bird dogs, and bulldogs morph into lapdogs, lazy dogs, and yellow dogs, the nation is in trouble. And what in many ways also is that what we are seeing again today, there's some of the most important developments we are witnessing is that this information technology revolution has changed the way we get the media, news from the media. And we saw it actually probably the best examples, the CNN revolution that we've heard about, basically when the CNN gave us a seat almost at the same time that government leaders were seeing events as they unfolded, whether it was in the Russian Revolution, whether it was the Iraq War, or in other incidents. One of them was perhaps the color revolutions in Eastern Europe. And probably one of the best examples was the kidnapping that took place in the late 90s of the Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan. And within less than 24 hours, about 24 hours actually, Kurds in almost every Western European capital had a demonstration. And the way they did that was basically by doing it through using the telephone, fax, and other contacts. So basically this is what's happening with the media. It's changing everything that the way we used to get our information. This media also, or this factor, has contributed to what we have been witnessing all over the Arab world with the rise of a new media, both a new pan-Arab media on the one hand, and also in a new media that has been using satellite and crossing state borders, which is something that used to be very difficult before the coming of the satellites. And we have channels such as Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, NBC, ANN, and many others that have been able to reach much broader audience. Another factor that has contributed to the problem, actually, in terms of the way problem of the Western media's coverage of the Arab world and Middle East issues in general, and of course the Palestinian issue, may have been a story that was written by a Tunisian journalist by the name of Jamaluddin Karmawi, who said that the way that media covered the stories of Iraq and of the Palestinians changed his way of looking at the American media and his respect for that media. He said this. He said, there was a time when we avoided looking Western reporters in the eye. They created many a complex in us. They made us feel like dwarfs and convinced us that we are incompetent. But we saw them in action, and we could not believe it. We saw them committing perjury. We saw them displaying hypocrisy and animosity and shaping public opinion in their hands as clay. We saw them communicating or romanticizing smart bombs and the so-called bloodless surgical technology. We have seen them weep for oil-soaked birds and describe the torn limbs of Iraqi victims as pro-Saddam propaganda. That changed the way many people, including some journalists, began to look at the role of the Western media, to which they looked up to before that. Another problem when it comes to the Palestinian issue and to the general coverage of foreign affairs is that what the late journalist, American journalist, Claudia Wright, described as the deep throat system of journalism. Basically, what she was talking about when she was talking about that was the reliance of many in the media, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, as well as other and the television channels, on official sources for a story to be covered. That if a story is going to get covered, they needed to have official sources for it, and often those official sources have not were not given the kind of they were given anonymity, which made it very difficult for people to really determine what's going on. And again, we saw a perfect example of this before this last Gaza war, when Israeli officials were speaking to the American media, and especially the press, and they were covered. They were anonymous. They were, while at the same time they were presenting the government's perspective. I think one of the main problems, and this is the last point that I want to make about this, is that for the Palestinians, it has been there's another problem, and that is Palestinians have generally been invisible. The Palestinians were removed, and not only geographically, but in terms of their identity. Their identity was to a large extent and for a long time eliminated. If we go back and to some of the studies that were done in the 40s and afterwards, we see that the way the American media covered the story, basically about what they described the Arab inhabitants of Palestine. Sometimes we saw the story saying they referred to the Palestinians as Jordanians, at other times as non-Jordanian Arabs. And of course, this is something a little unusual. I remember one story where it was covered. There was a wedding on the Jordanian side of the border, Palestinian weddings, which had Jordanians and Palestinians. And one media article said that this was Arabs on the Jordanian side. Another said these were Jordanians. Another said these were Israeli Arabs. So you had the same family almost and their friends portrayed in three different ways by the media. The Palestinians also have been both portrayed as victims and as aggressors. Generally speaking, they were portrayed as people without a clear identity, and that has been one of the problems. Let me just turn quickly, and I won't try not to take. How much time do we have? I want to go quickly and touch on two stories that I believe were part of the problem and contributed to the change. One is what happened to Ayman Muhyiddin, who was a journalist, used to be with Al Jazeera, and later on he joined NBC. Ayman Muhyiddin happened to be on the beach in Gaza when the Israelis attacked, and 4 boys that he was playing soccer with on the beach were killed. And what he did was that he started tweeting, and he sent some pictures out. And within a very, very short time after that, NBC pulled him out, and they said for security reasons. And then they sent in Richard Engel, the person who really paid the most attention to this and started the ball rolling on the story of what happened to Ayman. Was Glenn Greenwald. I don't know if the name rings a bell for many of you, but he's the one who really did a very good job. He contacted executives at NBC and asked them why did this happen. Of course, they told the story was that it was for security reasons, but it wasn't security reasons because in reality they sent Engel in there, and afterwards also they sent with him a young producer who didn't know Arabic, didn't know the region, and that raises a lot of questions about what they did. But also it wasn't just that, but when that story came, Brian Williams had it in the evening news, but it wasn't Ayman Muhyiddin who was telling the story. He sent us information to Engel, who was in Tel Aviv at that time, and he's the one who reported the story, he and as well as Brian Williams. And that also raises a lot of questions because it was his story, and he was pulled out of it. By the way, Ayman Muhyiddin also was with Shireen Tadros, another young Egyptian journalist producer who did a very, very good documentary on the 2012 war, because they were the only non-Palestinian or local reporters at that time. That story and the way it was covered, and when you had somebody like a Pulitzer Prize winner, journalists like Greenwald covering it, I think it began to have an impact, and there was quite a bit of criticism of NBC. The other story was actually the one by Diane Sawyer, the anchor at CBS, and basically she showed a picture of a destroyed house and a family picking their belongings, and she described it as on the evening news that this was an Israeli family that was suffering from Hamas attacks. Well, there was a very sharp reaction after that, and she corrected it, and it received a great deal and expressed her regrets. And she said this was misidentification, but that story also played an important part in influencing the way people began to look, in the sense that, and it may have happened by accident, which is what happened, but it showed the Palestinians as human beings who are suffering, actually, as a result. This was a very stark picture. I think what we are seeing is we are beginning to see a change, and I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thanks to the Palestine Center for the invite, and to Ali and Tamara for all the work they've done putting this together. And to Dr. Gharib for a really thorough summary, basically, of what happened in Gaza and U.S. media coverage in general. I would like to focus more specifically about coverage on this latest assault on Gaza last summer. I think if we were to put it in a nutshell, kind of a diagnosis of media coverage, I think it would be fair to say that it's simultaneously a huge improvement over American media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general over many years, but at the same time coverage that remains very deeply problematic for so many reasons. Not the least of which is the fact that the conflict was basically portrayed as an equal war between two sides. If you compare it to the early days of the Second Intifada, the coverage was exclusively looking at the situation, portraying Israel as a victim of Palestinian violence that is defending itself against that violence. So when you look at it, in this case, being portrayed as an equal conflict, that's an improvement. But of course, we know that that remains still a huge problem. In terms of a false moral equivalence, when you're talking about an occupier and an oppressor fighting against an occupied and oppressed population, as well as in terms of the balance of power, where you have Israel having the most sophisticated military technology in the world, fighting against effectively a defenseless population with some makeshift rockets and guns and so on. In terms of positive aspects of coverage, the former executive director here of the Palestine Center, Yusuf Manayer, who was here at the time that this all was unfolding, he was on virtually every major American news outlet talking about what was happening in Gaza. So the fact that there was room for a Palestinian voice does mark an improvement that is noteworthy. The fact that Chris Hayes at MSNBC was very critical of Israel's killing of civilians. Even Jon Stewart of The Daily Show, now we're sad to see him go, also his coverage of this issue was pretty decent. And I think this is something that we should all in this room take credit for. Anybody who's active on the issue of Palestine, this has come through very, very hard work of activists who have made sure that this particular voice does make it into mainstream outlets. But given the fact that there's so much that does remain problematic, this is what I think is more worthy of focusing on. As the issue of Israel in American politics is increasingly becoming partisan, and you can see that in polling results, where there is more criticism of Israel on the Democratic side of the aisle, more liberal segments of the population, and less so on the conservative side. That's also reflected in the way different media outlets react to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general and the war in Gaza in particular. So when you look at the way Fox News handled coverage, when you read op-eds that were published in the Wall Street Journal, I mean, the bias is so blatant and overwhelming that I don't really think it's worthy of any analysis. It's very much in your face, and everybody can see it and look at it and see it for what it is. On the other hand, the sort of bias that exists more subtly in other mainstream media outlets that are not aligned with the right in the U.S. is what I would like to look at more closely. So one problem, for example, is the acceptance of Israel's narrative of the beginning of the conflict, or any round of conflict for that matter. In previous assaults on Gaza in 2008 and 9, and again in 2012, the narrative was always Israel is responding to Hamas rockets. That's the starting point, and everything follows. Israel is always responding to Palestinian violence. Even though the fact that Israel was the one that violated the ceasefires in these cases, this just goes completely invisible. And the same was true in this particular case, where everybody accepted that the beginning point of this conflict was the 3 settlers who were kidnapped and murdered in the West Bank. Now, the fact that just one day before that happened, a Palestinian man and a 10-year-old child were killed in Gaza through an Israeli airstrike was nowhere to be seen, and nobody ever entertains that that might have been the starting point. So the starting point is always arbitrarily whenever Palestinians carry out violence and Israel decides to respond in a way that is grossly disproportionate to that violence. Another problem is the fact that equal weight is given through all these mainstream media outlets to Israel's claims about what happened as they do to international institutions and human rights organizations. So, and this, by the way, does not happen in any other conflict. I mean, at least no conflict that I have seen. Comparatively, if you look at the very beginning of the Syrian uprising, before it was ISIS and different groups, at the very beginning, when unarmed protesters were getting killed, everybody laid responsibility for that with the government. And even though the government tried to say that there were gunmen who were responsible, it wasn't really government forces, nobody took that seriously. Nobody, media outlets had not covered that with equal weight to what human rights observers were saying about the situation. By contrast, when Israel bombs civilians in Gaza, and the UN comes out and says there was no rocket fire anywhere near the shelters that Israel bombed, and Israel says, oh no, we were just responding to nearby rocket fire, the media just presents these as 2 equal possibilities, and it's up for you to decide what really happened. So this, given Israel the benefit of the doubt, in terms of what really happened, and giving what Israel says equal weight to what international organizations say, is one form of bias that is very subtle. And it's also true with the incident that Dr. Gharib mentioned with the 4 kids on the beach. Israel claimed that it was targeting a military installation and that the kids were killed by accident. The UN came out with a report saying there were no military targets in the area and there was no rocket fire reported anywhere near the place where the incident took place. And again, instead of taking the side of what international organizations are saying, the media just presents these two narratives out there as a possibility for you to take and consider. Now, an interesting thing with the incident of, this is not really happy with me, there we are. The incident of the 4 kids that were killed on the beach in Gaza is that the first headline the New York Times put out was 4 young boys killed playing on Gaza beach. As blunt as it could be about the situation, and then a few hours later, that headline changed to boys drawn to Gaza beach and into center of Mideast strife. Suddenly, it's a lot more vague. And nobody knows exactly what that changes. I work in media, and I know that the more compelling a headline is, the more likely someone is to click on it. That is part of the driving force for making a good headline. So there is no journalistic explanation for why the headline would be watered down and less interesting and more confusing. And it's really up to you to speculate why speaking bluntly about Palestinian civilian deaths in media outlets somehow is considered as something that is worthy of changing. A third problem is the fact that Israeli casualties are given more weight than Palestinian casualties. And perhaps the worst example of that was this headline by the Washington Post. The big text at the top, 2 Israeli soldiers killed in Gaza clash. In small text below, death toll tops 330 as Hamas militants step up attacks. Now, 2 obvious problems here. First problem, the 2 Israeli soldiers count more than the 330 civilians. And then even if you ignore the top part and just look at the bottom part, what impression do you get looking at death toll tops 330 as Hamas militants step up attacks? You might get away with the impression that it's Israeli civilians who are being killed by the hundreds because of Hamas attacks, when in fact it's Palestinian civilians who are being killed by the hundreds because of Israeli attacks. So for the casual viewer of media who's just looking through headlines, you can see how they can get the exact opposite impression of what is actually happening just by looking at this headline over here. Another example that Dr. Gharib also mentioned about Diane Sawyer, who got, basically this is the scene that she was describing, and she said this is an Israeli family digging up through the rubble to look for their belongings. Turns out it's actually Palestinian, and this is where social media did something very interesting. There was a hashtag that went trending immediately afterwards, which was called Tweet Like ABC. And people really made fun of the situation, and it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, if you look at the tweets that come up, each one of them has several hundred retweets. Exclusive footage of Hamas destruction of Israel, clearly from a science fiction movie. Terrorist Palestinians' homes attacking peaceful Israeli bulldozers, hundreds of retweets again. And this, of course, from Independence Day, aliens attacking Earth, and it's Hamas attacking an airfield. The fact that this sort of thing ends up going viral, and that now we have a media culture where whatever goes viral on social media ends up getting coverage in traditional media, says that this is not only creating a counter narrative to what exists, but also this ends up effectively applying pressure on those traditional media outlets and holding them accountable in a way that was much more difficult before. And the last thing I will say is that the biggest missing piece is the fact that American media coverage is effectively devoid of any context about what is happening. So when you talk about whether it's the 3 settlers being kidnapped as the starting point, or whether it was the day before when a bombing happened, the truth is none of that matters, because the starting point of this entire conflict is the fact that there is an ongoing occupation. The fact that the Palestinians are an occupied people living under an illegal military occupation supported by the United States, the fact there has been so many opportunities to end that occupation, and that Israel has chosen at every turn not to end that occupation in favor of building more and more settlements, that context, when you take that away, the viewer is left with nothing. You cannot understand what is actually happening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if you don't understand that there is an occupation. So the fact that this context is missing is really what leads fundamentally to people carrying on with this assumption that, oh, this is thousands of years, Arabs and Jews killing each other, who knows what's happening, it can't be solved. Yeah, certainly people would come away with that impression with some basic facts are simply hidden or just not visible for them through American media. I think I'll stop here and just, I think it would be good to just hear more from what you guys have to say and do a question and answer. Thanks.
My question is, media react or behave during crisis often. So it was given many examples of where crisis issues that media tried to cover. So during the last war on Gaza, we all felt like journalists on social media. And at some point, sometimes, there are a few things that I didn't like, or there are statements or actions by the Palestinian officials, for example. But I would question myself before I post anything or criticize them, because we are in a war zone or during a crisis. So can I criticize my leadership now, or it's not the right time? And in Hebrew, they have a saying which is Yurim Shikutim. Which means that they are shooting, shut up. So during the war, you cannot criticize the army, you cannot criticize the government. So how would you expect media to react in this case, or how should they react? Especially most of the journalists, whether Palestinians and Israelis, they are parts of the conflict. They cannot put their emotions aside. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And what Omar just mentioned, one of the main things that I think the media needs to do, one of the main things that the media needs to do is basically to give context to the story. That's all you can ask them, to tell the story as they see it, and in the end they are there, especially those who are on the ground, but not only the ones who are on the ground, but the ones who are also covering the story, and especially the editors who are working for the newspapers or for TV or whatever. I think they have a unique role, they have a special role to play. Actually, I remember that reminded me of a story at one time during the 1982 Gaza-Lebanon war, when the Israelis were attacking Beirut, West Beirut, Palestinians, the PLO in West Beirut. One of the journalists at that time, who's, I'm sure all of you know his name, and sometimes probably it would be more, those of you who are on the Palestinian side might be more critical, but at that time what he did, actually, he wrote a story and talked about what he described as the indiscriminate Israeli attacks in West Beirut, including on civilian population. And he sent that story to his editor back home. And the editor actually removed certain words, including he removed the word indiscriminate. And to his credit, Friedman, what he did is he sent another letter, another article, and he sent it on the open wire. He sent it to his editor, Rosenthal. I think his name was Rosenthal, and he chastised him, and Rosenthal was a very influential person. And he sent it on the open wire, on the Reuters wire, and that made it very interesting, because had he sent it just like through the normal channel to the New York Times, nobody would have seen it, but he sent it over the Reuters wire, and that meant almost anybody who subscribed to Reuters did get that, and that helped in a way to begin to change some of the coverage that we saw at that time. So it's not going to change everything, but what I'm saying is that journalists themselves have a responsibility to tell the story as they see it, as do their editors, and as do the public. The public here, for example, if you are as a reader or a TV watcher, and you find that something is wrong, that the way the story is being covered, the story is not the correct way, is not reflecting the reality on the ground. So you should make your voice heard. I think that's would be something, and this is something that we have heard. In fact, but the problem has been that while usually pro-Israeli voices speak much more loudly and clearly and more often than pro-Palestinian voices. I'll give you one other example of this. I don't know if you've heard of the syndicated columnist by the name of Georgian Geyer. Georgian Geyer used to write in over 100 newspapers, 150 newspapers, something like that, a column 3 times a week. And So one time I interviewed her, and I was asking her what kind of a reaction does she get, because she was one of the few columnists who presented the Palestinian issue in a balanced way. I wouldn't say necessarily always positive, but a balanced way. And she said that whenever she writes a story that appears to be positive, her editors get calls and letters, many calls and letters from people who are pro-Israeli and criticize that column. And I asked her, how many did you get from the pro-Palestinian side? She said, very rarely. Maybe sometimes we got a letter, one letter, maybe two, but we rarely got any kind. So I think that's one way. I'm not saying that this is going to solve all the problem, but that these are at least some way.
Going to squeeze in one tiny thing. I think the most commendable Israeli outlets were the ones that were very critical of Israel's bombing of Gaza during the war, and I think that the same should apply to anybody who's weighing in on this conflict. If you can devote the bulk of your commentary on social media or anywhere else to the primary outrage that is unfolding, which is Israel's indiscriminate, unjustified attack on Palestinian civilians, but I don't think that that should hold you back from ever being critical of Palestinian officials, even in situations like this.
I can speak loudly. Hello, my name is Caroline Katba. I'm the media affairs coordinator at the Palestinian delegation. Thank you. At the general delegation of the PLO to the United States. So my question is concerning the blueprint, almost, of coverage throughout the last 3 Gaza wars. It appears that the United States media has in some way developed a formula on how to report the wars in Gaza. It seems to not have developed as much, but what seems to have developed is their opposition and their understanding of the opposition to their coverage. Because, for example, when Israel was under a media gag order, in a way, so was the United States. And it seems that the relationship between Israel and Israel and the United States, has affected their policy in such a way that it actually affects their media, to the point where free media is no longer free media. It has to always be subservient to U.S. foreign policy, which with regards to Israel is just Israeli policy. So my question is, how do you keep the media free, especially with regard to actions like this? Because you had someone like the New York Times editor write a letter basically whining, saying that if I write about this, people will get angry, and if I write about this, people will get angry. She wrote a whole letter. The editor of the New York Times, to write a letter like that, that shows you something. That shows you that she herself is not free to do this. And she even talked about her correspondence back in the Middle East and how all of them have either had children in the IDF or who live in Tel Aviv, who have never been to the Gaza Strip. In addition to that, let's not forget that Israel had a policy of no foreign journalists in Gaza. So you had people reporting from the border who had a lot of FaceTime with the soldiers. And then, of course, you had Mark Regev, who just came out and spoke and was never challenged until, of course, the UK Jon Snow challenged him, especially on the bombing of the hospital. But within the US media, people did not challenge him. So it appears that freedom of the media in a democracy, whichever one we're talking about, is not really free. So how would we move on from here, aside from just focusing on social media and people reporting on the ground from their own perspective without any journalistic experience? How do we revert the media back to a free space?
I'll take one side with this. I think it is absolutely true that major media outlets do follow power. So in this case, you have a political establishment in the United States where across both parties, there is almost unconditional support for Israel. And that basically creates a culture where I don't think it's so much people consciously putting limits on themselves in terms of what they can and can't say, as much as it is just it becomes really ingrained in the way they think that you reflexively are more sympathetic to one side, sees them as closer to us and the other side as other. I think this is beginning to shift in terms of public opinion in general. And always the last thing to change is the policy-making level. So as people are becoming more and more aware, thanks to the work of activists who have been very active on this issue in the US, I think eventually you're going to get to the point to where even the policy conversation opens up, and as a reaction to that, major media outlets as well. But in the meantime, I think it is absolutely crucial to continue to leverage whatever media outlets that you do have access to. More liberal spaces, outlets, whether you're talking about Salon or Slate or Huffington Post, And what I mentioned earlier during my talk, MSNBC with Chris Hayes, they had Yusuf Munayyer on, they had Noor Arakat on. There is more space for people of different persuasions than what used to be considered mainstream to speak more. And I think it is absolutely crucial that you continue to utilize those outlets. And in cases where you can't get to the media, to television, certainly print outlets and internet outlets are absolutely crucial. I can tell you from my personal experience, I wrote a blog for the Huffington Post entitled 5 Lies the Media Keeps Repeating About Gaza back in 2012. That blog got 40,000 hits. I mean, it was everywhere. And then I wrote an article for Salon this time around, again, nearly 100,000 shares on Facebook alone, busting myths that the media tells. So you have to utilize these spaces. They are open to different points of view, and I think it is absolutely crucial to keep pressure on these outlets. And I'll mention just one last thing. I'm currently working on a YouTube series where I'm busting individual pervasive Israeli arguments. The last one I did was about the use of human shields, the fact that Israel always blames the deaths of Palestinians on supposedly Palestinian militants using civilians as human shields. Going through it and breaking it down point by point, showing that it's actually Israel that had a policy of using Palestinian human shields, Palestinian civilians as human shields, the fact that the Supreme Court ruled against that practice and the Israeli military objected to the Supreme Court ruling that they can't use Palestinians as shields. You're presenting information that the American public simply has no awareness of at all. And you have the outlets to use it. And again, that video also went viral. Within a few days, it had thousands of views. So wherever, whether you're talking about media outlets where you can write something or whether you're talking about your own outlets through social media or YouTube or so on, these are the sorts of things that have to be leveraged in the meantime and will only accelerate the shift in public discourse that could open up traditional media in the long run.
Briefly, I'll say that I agree with you. There is a symbiotic relationship between media, especially mainstream media, and a lot of media, big media in a way, and the government. They feed off of each other, and for a story to be covered, unfortunately, sometimes take a look at the pages of the Washington Post or the New York Times. Most of the stories are basically relying on government officials, and often they are anonymous. So there is that problem, but that should not stop anybody from trying to reach out, trying to make their voices heard, and through letters, through calls, and other means, as Omar mentioned. In addition to this, I think there's many Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, to become journalists, to join the media. I think that might be also one way to try to, that's how others have done it, in fact. So it's not something that's impossible to do. And, but just to be there and to make your voice heard, there's an American adage which says the squeaking wheels get the attention, and so you have to squeak so that you can get, so you can be heard.
Very quickly, we do have a question from our Twitter audience. So, and this question is for the both of you. Do you see social media coverage, Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, being more important in providing a more realistic perspective of the conflict?
Would I take that one?
You're closer.
I would be wary to say, it certainly presents a much more diverse array of voices, and therefore there's a lot more truth that is filtering through social media. More important, that's really hard to say. I mean, I think ultimately the goal is to try to leverage social media to create pressure on more traditional media outlets. So I think the ultimate goal is still to get the big major corporate news outlets to fix their coverage on this. And to me, social media is the tool through which you can get that done. And maybe with the newer generation, as more and more people do get their news effectively through social media, I think that is very useful in the long run. It could become more important than traditional media, but I'm not sure that we're at that point quite yet.
I agree. I don't think it's as important today, especially when it comes to influencing decision makers. Nevertheless, it's a very important tool. One of the other things I want to go back also to part of what you're saying and what you said earlier. One of the things that we are seeing now, there is a change. One of the things in terms of looking at the Palestinians over the years, despite the media bias, if you want to describe it as that, most Americans said we should not become involved in that conflict. So we wanted to maintain a certain sense of neutrality, and that's significant. Another important development, and there was, I think, a Pew poll not too long ago, which said that there's a big difference between people who are over 29 in the United States, the way they view this conflict. The ones who are over 29 are much more sympathetic to the Israeli side, but those under 29, including Jewish Americans, were more sympathetic or more understanding of the Palestinian perspective, and that's something very significant. And also, one of the other things that surprised me was Latin American, Latinos, people of Latino origin or Hispanic origin in the United States were very extremely sympathetic. It might be worth it for somebody to go into looking at the reasons why this is the case.
In the back, gentleman in the back.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I think something else that's important to talk about for Gaza, not just during these assaults, but what happens afterward. And what we see usually is, so they have an agreement to a ceasefire, and then almost immediately after that, on the Gaza border and in the sea, Israeli soldiers start firing at farmers and fishermen. And this happens, according to Oxfam, over 700 times since the August ceasefire. And there's hardly any attention in the media. It's just basically ignored. Maybe there'll be a blurb if somebody is killed or something like that. And then, and then the conditions deteriorate in Gaza. There's no electricity. There's a heat wave now. I mean, people are, suffering badly. And but then when one rocket is fired outside, you often, these same journalists that are covering the conflict and don't talk about when Israel is firing into Gaza and the conditions there, all of a sudden they're almost like the first ones to retweet the information about the one rocket that's being fired. I know that Yusuf Munir, the director here, covered that, and he had a blog looking at the ceasefire violations. But could you just maybe address that issue, that the hundreds of shootings into the Gaza are just ignored totally, but then these rocket fires are
honestly, all I can say is you're
coverage.
absolutely correct. I mean, that's 100% true, and I don't think I have much to add apart from what Dr. Gharib earlier said. Just you need to be the squeaky wheel. You just have to, it is on us to make sure that these incidents get the same coverage. Whenever there is any casualty on the other side, or a firing, or a rocket, or violence of any kind, the way that organizations that work for Israeli interests in the United States swing into action immediately, collectively, the outreach they do to American media outlets, the stuff that goes up on their front pages of their websites, I think this is exactly the sort of thing that we have to be doing whenever Palestinians are shot at, to make sure that we generate the same kind of interest.
Hi. I find it kind of curious that this was not brought up, and maybe it's viewed as being a little politically incorrect. Nobody really has mentioned who owns the majority of media outlets in this country. There was a former correspondent on CNN named Rick Sanchez who did so and subsequently lost his job. Never mind that there was a guy named Joel Stein in the Hollywood Reporter who openly bragged about who does and who's fine. So how can you fight against that? It's just like when you mentioned about our Congress being so pro-Israel, it's because of contributions from people.
I think, I don't want to overstate the significance of that. I think we live in a politically correct culture, generally speaking, increasingly so. That when somebody like Rick Sanchez says things that are politically incorrect, there's a cost for that. I think there's a cost for that in just about any community that you might make off comments about, perhaps with the exception of Arabs and Muslims, who seem to, right now, be basically the victims of a climate where it's okay to be openly critical of them as an entire community, and in some cases even flat out express bigotry towards Arabs and Muslims, and that still being okay within the mainstream. At the end of the day, honestly, I don't think that it really matters as much who owns the media, what groups that they happen to belong to, as much as there is just a culture from establishment. I mean, just if you look at the Jewish American population in the United States, the huge shift that we've seen in the past few years with the emergence of J Street, with the emergence of Jewish Voice for Peace, or so on, the diversity of views that exist within the Jewish community is so wide. And I think that within, it's becoming increasingly mainstream to be critical of Israel and still fit within the mainstream of Jewish Americans, that I don't really think that that's a particularly a factor that is as worthy of consideration. I mean, we can be critical of political correctness in general, but at the end of the day, I think we know what power structures media outlets follow. It has a lot more to do with a culture that existed for so long, with any kind of voice being sympathetic to Palestinians simply not being present for so long. And now that we're finally playing catch up We're playing against an entrenched culture where people reflexively see Israel as closer to who we are and the Palestinians as closer to the other. And that to me is where we should focus our challenge. Just keep doing, more and more of what we're doing.
I think the problem is bigger with the conglomerization of the media. What we are seeing now over the last 40 years. At one time, there used to be maybe something like, there are about 25,000 different media outlets in the United States, and they were owned by hundreds of people and companies. Well, now you have the majority of U.S. media outlets, be they major newspapers, television channels, radio stations, etc., film studios, are owned by 5 major corporations. And that is the problem, because that makes it very difficult to really get diversity. You need to have diversity. Can you imagine if half of these papers and TV were owned by one individual or one company? You would get thousands of different views. But at the same time, you would still have the cultural bias, if you want to call it that, or you have the think-alike atmosphere, and that's a problem. But the main thing is to try to make your voice heard. And I think things are changing, and they are changing for the better. So let's wait and see and keep trying to bring about change.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have. If you have questions, I'm sure Dr. Gharib and Mr. Badr will be free to field them once we conclude. But thank you very much again for speaking.